Today we're diving into one of the most intriguing stories in evolutionary biology, the story of encounters, interbreeding, and genetic exchange between Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens. For a while now, scientists have known this wasn't a simple replacement of one species by another. It wasn't a clean sweep. It was a long, messy history of contact, hybrid children, and complex genetic dynamics. And a new study adds an important twist. For thousands of years, interbreeding appears to have been asymmetric. Most mixed pairs were likely Neanderthal men and sapiens women, not the other way around. So how did researchers arrive at that conclusion? First, the basics: how much Neanderthal is in us? After the Neanderthal genome was sequenced under the leadership of Svante Pääbo, who received the Nobel Prize in 2022, it became clear that people living outside Africa today carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. But that doesn't mean you're 4% Neanderthal. What it means is, those are small fragments scattered across the genome. Each person carries a different set of fragments. Many Neanderthal variants disappeared relatively quickly after admixture, likely because they reduced fitness. Some of those inherited variants affected immune function, metabolism, risk of depression, type 2 diabetes, and even susceptibility to severe COVID-19. In other words, Neanderthal DNA wasn't neutral, it was filtered by natural selection. Here's where things get interesting. Neanderthal DNA isn't evenly distributed across our chromosomes. The X chromosome stands out dramatically. Researchers sometimes call it a Neanderthal desert, because it contains about 5 times less Neanderthal DNA than the rest of the genome. Quick refresher. Women have XX. Men have XY. Mothers always pass on an X. Fathers pass on either an X, to daughters, or a Y, to sons. So why is the X chromosome so cleansed of Neanderthal ancestry? Two main hypotheses were debated for years. 1. Genetic incompatibility. Maybe Neanderthal variants on the X chromosome didn't work well with the sapiens genome. Hybrids carrying certain combinations may have had lower survival or reduced fertility. This aligns with Haldane's rule: in interspecies hybrids, the heterogametic sex, in mammals, males, XY, is more likely to suffer reduced viability or fertility. 2. Asymmetric mating. Maybe it wasn't mainly about incompatibility. Maybe most interbreeding happened in one direction: sapiens women with Neanderthal men. For a long time, looking only at modern human genomes made it difficult to distinguish between these scenarios. But there's another side to the story, not just what we inherited from Neanderthals, but what they inherited from us. A research group led by Alexander Platt at the University of Pennsylvania examined how Neanderthal X chromosomes changed after contact with sapiens. Here's the key detail. One of the earliest known interbreeding events happened around 250,000 years ago, when an early wave of sapiens left Africa. That population appears not to have left direct descendants among modern humans. But its genetic traces survived, in Neanderthals. In particular, Neanderthal remains from the Altai region, about 120,000 years old, contain fragments of DNA from those early sapiens. That means hybrid children weren't just born, they survived, grew up in Neanderthal communities, and passed on their genes. When researchers analyzed the genomes of 3 Neanderthal females, dated to roughly 122,000, 80,000, and 52,000 years ago, they found something striking. Their X chromosomes contained 62% more sapiens-derived DNA than their autosomes, non-sex chromosomes. And much of that DNA was in non-coding regions, areas that don't obviously confer an adaptive advantage. That makes it less likely that the pattern is explained purely by positive selection. The researchers modeled several possibilities. Symmetrical interbreeding. Rare, sporadic contact. Strong genetic incompatibility. Long-term asymmetric mating. Only one scenario reproduced the observed genetic pattern: prolonged asymmetry, with most mixed unions involving Neanderthal men and sapiens women. Why does that matter? Because the X chromosome behaves differently depending on the sex of the parents. If the mother is sapiens and the father is Neanderthal, all daughters receive the father's Neanderthal X. All sons receive the father's Y and the mother's sapiens X. Over generations, this pattern leads to dilution of Neanderthal X chromosomes in sapiens populations, but accumulation of sapiens X chromosomes in Neanderthals. And that's exactly what the genomic data show. Why the asymmetry? The honest answer, we don't know. Possible explanations include demography, for example, small migrating groups of sapiens women integrating into Neanderthal communities. Social structure, such as patrilocality, where women move into the male partner's group. Violent encounters, including abduction of sapiens women by Neanderthal men. Sexual preferences. Like if Neanderthal men were attractive to sapiens women, while Neanderthal women were considered terrifying by sapiens men. Cultural barriers. Or even biological differences in reproductive compatibility. Maybe Neanderthal women were too big for sapiens men, if you know what I mean. I'm joking, obviously. In many mammals, mate choice is driven primarily by females. But in human societies, patterns depend heavily on social structure, and we know very little about the social norms of either Neanderthals or early sapiens. Modern paleogenomics shows that interbreeding is not an anomaly in evolution, it's common. We carry Neanderthal DNA. Some Melanesian populations carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. There were also episodes of gene flow between different archaic human groups themselves. Human evolution isn't a clean, branching tree. It's more like a braided network. So what does this change? First, it pushes back against the simplistic narrative that sapiens showed up and wiped everyone out. Yes, Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago. But before that, there were tens of thousands of years of contact between human lineages. Second, the genome preserves traces of social behavior. From the distribution of DNA fragments, we can infer not just biology, but likely patterns of residence, mating, and group integration. And finally, it reminds us that pure lineages are rare in nature. Our origins are the product of mixing, selection, demographic shifts, and chance. The story of human evolution isn't about isolation. It's about connection. Thank you for listening. If you think this was interesting, hit like and subscribe.